many people here in the room support an organization that sends people to the G20? Any involvement? I'm seeing like one. Okay. So like you said, the way that if I were you, taking this talk and making it practical, take G20 out and then to insert any conference, any summit, any event that you have people in your high level from your organization going to, and trying to look at how you can evaluate threats associated with it. So what I want to get at, I'll just cover a little bit about, background about my organization, a little background about the G20 as well, talk about some of the findings that I had when going and trying to evaluate the threats to it, walk through some of the analysis that I did after getting these findings, and then some recommendations and lessons learned. If there is one theme that I hope resonates and kind of comes through throughout this talk, it is this, and it's that while cyber threats are very dynamic and always changing, our perceptions are not. Our perceptions often end up getting anchored and stuck, and as a result, security, it has an impact on security. So, standard disclaimer, these views are mine and mine alone, not that of my organizations. What that really means is if I misspeak, it's all my fault, not theirs, and I could get fired. Now, who's this guy that might get fired? I am, like Cal said, my background, I've been working at the IMF as a threat intel officer for not quite the last 3 years, but I've been doing strategic cyber intel for about that time, and a little bit longer. Prior to that, I was doing kind of military intelligence in the U.S. Army, doing more counterinsurgency, counterterrorism type of work, a couple times in Afghanistan. So I feel like now's a good time to really just talk about the IMF and just give like a real quick overview. I found a lot of people don't really understand who the IMF is and what the organization does. You can see the mission statement up there, but broadly speaking, our purpose and our mission is to monitor and promote the health and welfare of the global economy. Very similar to the UN, we're an international organization, and we've got member nations from all over the world. Specifically speaking, we've got 189 countries that are members of the IMF. And when I say countries that are members, I mean that like those countries' governments are members of the IMF, just like the UN. There's only about 4 countries that aren't. And we were birthed out of the same conference, the Bretton Woods Conference in 1945 that birthed the World Bank. However, you see that we are not the World Bank. It's funny, my own family confuses that. They'll call me like, oh, hey, how are things at the World Bank? It's like, I don't know. Things at the IMF are great, though. And so, you'd think after 3 years it wouldn't be a problem, but it kind of still is. So one of the, part of our role, and we work very closely with the World Bank, and so the way that I describe the difference is, if you're country X and you want to build a power plant, if you want to do some development, you go and get a loan from the World Bank. If you're country X and you're having trouble paying back a loan, you go to the IMF. We are often known as the lender of last resort. We do a lot more than just loaning money, but that is what we're probably most known for, at least in the news. Because of our membership and because of our role, we have a really, very good look at the world's economy. And we have a good idea of what's happened, why it's happened, and a decent idea of what's coming next and what that means for markets. What it also means is that we make a very useful intermediary, an interlocutor, I'm pretty sure I said that wrong, but between different countries. And as a result, that's one of the reasons why we're a member of the G20. So Rob just got done giving an excellent talk about intel preparation of the cyber environment. We actually underwent that same exercise last year, and he talked about some of the use cases for doing that. Well, this is actually one of those use cases. So when we went and we started evaluating all the threats that could come to either IMF individuals or to organizations by way of the IMF, what we found is that we were actually exposed to more threats by virtue of our affiliation with the G20 than we were with our other big meetings, which are called the annual meetings and spring meetings, that we co-host or co-do with the World Bank. And so that was really interesting. That was something that people in our organization didn't expect, and as a result, got people thinking. When I presented these findings, one of the people that I presented to was like, hey, this is really interesting. Did you know that the G20 is more than just the leaders summit that happens and everyone reads about in the news. That there are actually several working groups and ministerial meetings that lead up to the G20. We send people to all those meetings and working groups. Do those people incur the same level of cyber risk by virtue of going to those as the people that go to this leader summit do? And I responded like any good intel person did. I don't know. And so let me get back to you. And so what I basically spent the next couple months doing, I got asked that question like April of last year, and spent the next few months coming up with the answer. And so I started working on a detailed analysis. And so my methodology there was simple. It was first look internally and then next look externally. So looking internally, I tried to go and review all of the past incidents that we had that had any kind of connection with the G20. Then look at our telemetry as far back as the data would go and see any kind of threats that we had caught or blocked that had anything to do with G20. And then the last thing, I scoped it down to just the people that were from our organization that attended the G20 summits or working groups and looked, all right, let's take a deeper dive into stuff that we caught. Is anything appearing more targeted or more sophisticated that we might have missed at first look? And then it looked externally. So I think now's a good time to go and give a little background about the G20, because when I first got this question, I knew basically nothing about the G20. And so if I had to guess, I'm probably not alone. And so the G20, sorry, this isn't a pew-pew map. I know that would have been the only thing that could have made this better is if there's like lights and sounds flinging across the stage. But so the G20, or Group of 20, represents the top 19 nations and the EU, top meaning top in landmass, top in population size and GDP. And they've come together ever since the financial crisis, or roughly about 2009, to help kind of solve big problems and do it faster than what international bodies like the UN or IMF can do. IMF and UN and other organizations like us are very consensus-driven, and as a result, we move a little bit more slowly. Organizations like the G20, because they're smaller, they can move forward more quickly. And because they're the leading nations, what they decide to do has a bigger impact, and a lot of other nations follow suit. So you see there, 19 nations plus the EU. Guest countries also come as well. From a governance standpoint, the way it works, and this is kind of, it's important. Every country, every member rotates every year being the president. And so whoever the president of that country is now the chairperson for the G20. So last year, Germany was the president. So Angela Merkel was the president or chairperson of the G20. Year before that, China. Year before that, Turkey. Year before that, Australia, and so on and so forth. What that also means is that not only is that person the chair, but their country hosts the summit and all those working groups. So last year, all the meetings were being held in Deutschland. And so this year, it's all going to be in Argentina. So when you look at it, there are 2 tracks for all of these working groups. There's about 12 working groups, and you can see them listed there. And they're divided up between a financial track and a leader track, also known as a Sherpa track. Don't ask me why they call it the Sherpa track, it just is. The way that I think about it, if I'm in the U.S. Treasury, I go on the finance track. If I'm State Department, I go on the leader track or the Sherpa track. So the way that it works, all of these working groups get together, and they, people from all of the G20 nations talk about problems going on in that specific thing. So whether it's agriculture or anti-corruption, talk about the big issues that need to be addressed, and come up with policy recommendations. And then these individual working groups meet throughout the year, and then they propose something that gets signed off at the Leaders Summit, and all of the leaders sign on to this. And it ends up being like the thing there, this communique. That's how the Leaders Summit concludes. That part's actually relevant for the next talk, so just kind of file that one away for later. But it's this non-binding resolution that says, we, the members of the G20, say that this is something that's wrong, and we're going to do this about it, or we do approve of this, or we don't approve of that. So that's actually, like I said, it's important for later. On the IT side, the way that it works, if you are the nation that's hosting it, you're also setting up the conference network for all the G20 attendees. It's actually not that dissimilar from the network that SANS has set up here. Because otherwise, all the other nations are basically just doing all their work in their own organizations and just emailing it back and forth to everybody else. So one of the things that I did, even before I started looking at all the incident data, I went and met with some of the people that attend the summit, actually physically from our organization, go to these summits, go to these meetings, and got to understand how they actually operate, what they do, what some of the classification of the information is, what they're actually talking about, some of the concerns they have, vulnerabilities they've identified, et cetera. That was incredibly useful. I'm so glad I did that. And I'll talk a little bit more about why later. So now, when I came into this exercise, and to a large extent, the baseline that we did kind of confirmed this, was that, hey, there's a lot of hackers targeting the G20, right? That is definitely the thing that you will see if you Google cyber threats and G20. There's just hackers galore. You see all these articles, 133,000 cyber attacks hitting China. Oh my God, it just seemed a bit overwhelming, right? Well, let's see what the data actually says. So when I looked at our incidents over as long as I could get incident data for, I saw that we had about 5 incidents over the last several years that were linked with the G20. We had 2 in 2011, 1 in 2013, and 2 in 2014. Our threat baseline identified the primary vectors were phishing and then malicious USB flash drives. So we didn't see any malicious USB flash drives, but we obviously, as you see there, the incidents had a lot of phishing kind of themes going with it. There was also a lot of G20 kind of themed phishing that we blocked in 2015. But when I looked in our telemetry, I didn't see anything in 2016 and nothing up to that point in 2017, which I thought was interesting. I was like, oh, this doesn't line up with what I thought. When I looked for USBs targeting our or malicious flash drive related to G20, there was nothing. There was nothing significant about what we were catching from the G20 attendees. So all this was kind of interesting. So I decided to go back and look and do some deeper look at the incidents and trying to do some timeline analysis, see when they lined up with other events. I didn't have the specific working group dates for back then, but I did have the leader summit. So I just tried to correlate when these incidents happened with when the leader summits were, whether it was before, during, or before, after, or kind of in the middle. And so what we found is it was a little bit all over the place. So as I'm looking at it more, it wasn't quite making sense, and it made me realize that I missed something. That, and as I would ask you, what is the big assumption? The big assumption that I had made is that any incident that had any mention of G20 in it, any email that had any mention of G20 in it, whether it was, regardless of who the recipient of the email was, whether it was in the subject line or the sender, or the body, or the attachment, that I thought it was connected. That is a big assumption, and I should have identified that up front. But I failed to do it, and what that meant is that it cost me a lot of time in doing my analysis. I now had to kind of start over. So when I started realizing that, I figured, okay, let's scope this down to just G20 attendee recipients and see what I get. And so when I did that, didn't get anything different in our telemetry, but what I did get from just the incidents, I saw that the primary timing of it was prior to the leader summit. So when I thought about, okay, that's interesting, why could that be? Well, one of the classic Intel use cases is if you have a leader that's going to an event, a meeting, or what have you, you as an Intel organization want to help prep your boss or your decision-making person with information leading up to it. You want to not only tell them, hey, this is what people are saying, but you want to know what they really say, or what they really think. And so that is one hypothesis that I have for this. This was people trying to prep attendees in advance for that. So that's something that I think needs to be evaluated and confirmed later. So again, though, going back, when I looked again at the 2015 phishing data that we had, it was all, after I saw it, it was all false positives, really. Looking at it, I feel like we kind of tuned our rules a little bit too high and caught a bunch of stuff. And again, I think because we had this perception that G20 equaled cyber threat, that we were blocking a lot of stuff that we maybe shouldn't have. So seeing that dip, I was kind of wondering, hey, is there really no cyber threat anymore? This doesn't make any sense. This doesn't line up with what I thought. So I decided to take a look again at the data that we had gotten outside of our organization and just kind of review what OSINT and what other Intel feeds had to say about it. And so you see there, this is a timeline view, and I've kind of lined up when the leader summits are, and tried to correlate this. The dots on the bottom represent mentions of cyber attack and the G20. And what I found is that there was definitely stuff going on in 2013, stuff going on in 2014. Didn't really see anything in 2015, and then that article about all hell breaking loose, 133,000 stuff happening in 2016. So this is actually a pet peeve of mine. And I'm going to go on a little bit of a soapbox here, so I apologize. When you see some absurd number and cyber threats or attacks or something, I immediately discount it. When you actually read that article, what it's saying is that there were 133,000 WAF blocks in a month for the network. I'm sorry, if that is the headline, there's nothing going on. Like, there are no hackers targeting that thing, or at least not that's publicly known. So I immediately discounted that. And so what this timeline is saying, it lines up with what we were seeing internally, that there hasn't been any notable publicly seen kind of cyber threats for the G20 since basically 2014. Now again, this isn't what I had expected. This definitely didn't line up with perception. So why is that? I started trying to dive into it around 2015 to see what could be the reason. And when I did, I found this tweet saying that Russia backs the norm barring industrial espionage at the G20. I was like, what the heck does that mean? What is that all about? So remember how each leader summit ends with a communique. I checked that for that year, and what it said on the 24th point is that no country should conduct or support ICT-enabled theft of intellectual property, including trade secrets or other confidential business information. For those that aren't familiar, ICT is the same thing as IT. It's just the way that Europeans say it. It's information communication technology. So anyway, so basically, all the nations there said, hey, we don't agree with stealing other people's trade secrets and using it for basically industrial espionage. That was in November of 2015. 1 month later, President Obama and President Xi met and signed the deal, basically saying that China and the US wouldn't do that either against each other. Shortly thereafter, all of us kind of noticed a rapid decline in associated or Chinese affiliated APT hacking in the US. So what does this mean? Does this mean that all cyber threats have kind of gone away, that we don't have to worry about that, or at least in the context of the G20? I wasn't so sure. So I'm trying to better understand this dip in activity. And so I went to do an ACH. I think the talks that led up to this did a great job of talking about ACH, because I actually echo every sentiment that they said. Both in that it does take a lot of time, like it took me a long time to do this, but what I found the benefits of doing it is it helped provide structure and rigor to my analysis and to my thought process. I had 3 hypotheses that I was trying to go and evaluate here. The first was, all right, so the attack volume hasn't changed. It stayed the same. However, what has happened is attackers are now more stealthy, and so it's still happening, but we can't see it. We're not detecting it well. So that was hypothesis 1. The second hypothesis was that, so the attackers have either stopped attacking or reduced their volume to such a level that it's basically not being picked up. That was hypothesis 2. Hypothesis 3 is kind of similar, is that they've shifted from trying to get access to a device or an agent or a network and switch primarily to man-in-the-middle type attacks where they can get information without being detected. Now, as I'm talking about this and as I've been thinking about this talk, I realized that I kind of one of the problems with these hypotheses is that 2 and 3 aren't actually mutually exclusive. And so that would have been more ideal, because you can actually have 2 and 3 both work together. They can both happen simultaneously. So the way, for those that haven't done ACH or aren't necessarily familiar with it, the goal is not to prove a hypothesis, but rather to try and disprove a hypothesis and get to the hypothesis that is most consistent with the evidence, or at least inconsistent with the evidence. So the C means consistent, 2 C's means really consistent, N means not consistent, or double N is you're not even sure why that hypothesis is there. So when I did that, I used the Park ACH software, which for me was actually helpful. It's easier than using a spreadsheet at times. The problem that I have with it is you can't export your results, so that part kind of sucks. But in doing that, I found that the increased stealth was the least consistent with the evidence that we had, whether it was internal to us or external. The other two were equally inconsistent with the evidence. And so my conclusion there is that adversaries had either stopped attacking or had basically switched techniques so that they were listening. So at least, again, not necessarily groundbreaking, but it helped me kind of go through and have some structure for how I came to that conclusion. So, there we go. All right. So after I did the analysis, I was thinking, all right, can I just basically tell all the people that are attending, hey, just leave your burners at home. You can just keep your weak passwords, go in there, have fun, don't worry about security. I didn't feel comfortable doing that, so I decided to go and brainstorm all the different threat scenarios that a business traveler or a conference goer has to worry about, and then come up with recommendations for each. And so looking at the logical side, I'm obviously worried about all the bad things that could come in to them, whether it's through text message, email, whether it's through website, social media. I'm also worried about bad things that, or things that could get stolen as they're going out. So like those man-in-the-middle, threat scenarios. I'm concerned about those. But I'm also not just thinking the logical side. I'm also concerned about on the physical side, where our people might be plugging in a malicious or an infected USB flash drive, or connecting to a rogue hotspot, since most conference goers do all their work via either conference Wi-Fi or hotel Wi-Fi, or even worse, just Starbucks. The other kind of threat scenarios that are specific to the G20 that I was concerned with are getting a device compromised while crossing a border, so border guards, taking any physical access, putting something on a device, or then also people sneaking into hotel rooms and implanting something on the device there. Much harder to detect, a lot more gain. So brought all those up, put recommendations, went and wrote a long form of report. And I mean, everybody's heard like, oh, just you better make sure the executive summary reads well because no one's going to read the other 16 pages. But somebody actually read the report. I was so shocked, and I was so happy. I was literally riding a high for a week. It was great. They didn't take all the recommendations, but they took some, so I was feeling good. Then that was before the event. The event happened, so we were monitoring throughout the event and didn't notice anything malicious happening in connection with the G20. So it's like, okay, so far so good. When the conference was done, people, I went and kind of debriefed a couple of the attendees to get a better idea, like, hey, listen, did you notice anything bad or anomalous or malicious? And they were like, no, all kind of standard stuff. And so my conclusion there was like, hey, my assessment was right. I was so happy. I felt like that was an intel success. Then Turla. And I was like, proof point, why did you have to publish this? But I was actually, in hindsight, really glad they did. So what happened here after the G20 Leader Summit, Proofpoint discovered a maldoc that they linked with Turla that dropped a backdoor for anyone that would open up this document and enable the macro. So initially I thought like, my analysis was failed. This is clearly the stealth one. The ACH was worthless. Why did I even bother? But then as I started diving into this more, I found actually some really interesting things that kind of correlated with it. So one, they just found the maldoc. They never found any kind of phishing emails that had this. They never found any watering hole website, nothing. They don't even know who the victims are, potentially, or even the intended victims, other than it just says G20 and has a link to an agenda for one of the working groups. So if they're, going back to those three hypotheses that I had, this still kind of fits in that number two, where the attack volume had been so low that it really wasn't being detected. The other interesting thing about this is that this is the first time that I had seen any indication that attackers were using one of the working groups that kind of lead up to it to target or to get access to one of their victims. So that was the first time. All the rest of the time, it had just been focusing primarily on the Leader Summit itself. I didn't find anything targeting like those other working groups. So in kind of lessons learned time, so before we go to questions, sustains and improves. Definitely recommend using structured analytic techniques. What I found is it definitely forces us to be more thorough and give out better quality analysis. Also, highly recommend both interacting with the business up front. Whether if your customer's in the IT department, go meet with them directly. If your customer's outside the IT department, go interact with them directly. Sit down with them, have a coffee with them, or lunch is even better, and really try to understand what they're doing, what they're trying to do. And then also meet with them when they come back and debrief, because that's when you can really confirm whether the recommendations you gave were effective or if you missed something. Also, I work really closely with the Intel vendors that we have been partnered with, and they help do a lot of the collection, a lot of the analysis. So that was definitely really, really valuable for me. I couldn't have done it on my own, so strongly recommend leveraging them. From the improve side, definitely recommend starting the whole process earlier, especially the data collection and trying to maximize the amount of time you have to do analysis. 2 months, I probably spent a month and some change doing all the data collection, and then maybe like a week or so doing the analysis. The whole paradigm should have been flipped. I should have spent like a week doing collection and then about a month doing analysis. That would have been a lot better. The other one, don't make the rookie mistake that I did. Identify your assumptions up front. That's kind of an Intel 101 thing. And then the other thing, so I'm a very kind of short staff when it comes to Intel analysts and people. So as I was doing the analysis, it was basically just me doing that ACH. And I realized after the fact that I have so many biases that I'm throwing into this and so many preconceived notions, and it would be a lot better to have others doing that. So we're all part of different sharing communities. My recommendation, what I'm going to do next time, is identify a handful of people that I could feel comfortable sharing my raw product with and saying, hey, can you give some critical feedback into this and really kind of really check my analysis and make sure that either I haven't missed something or help me see what I'm missing, see a lot of the holes there. The other thing that I kind of found, and this is a bit self-serving since I do stuff more on the strategic side, is that cyber attacks are not a good predictive indicator of future threat activity. Kind of like what Carmen said earlier, trends are past. They're historic. They are not good evidence for the future. If you want to be more predictive and start to understand what the threat will be for an event your people are going to, you've got to understand the geopolitical situation. You have to understand the threat actors that are in it. Kind of like what Rob was talking about. You have to know the threat landscape. And that is really where strategic intel comes in and adds value. Because you can then try and take not only what has happened, but what you expect to happen based on reasonable evidence, and then help your security improve as a result of that. So again, consider the geopolitical situation. Because ultimately what that will help do is change perceptions so that they're more in line with the data, which is where they should be. So with that, I will leave you with a quote from one of the IMF's founders. The difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from old ones. Thank you very much for your time.